Tell me about purpose and telos within science. How do we study it today?
Well, I can answer that in two ways. I can tell you how I study it and kind of the work that I've been doing, or I can kind of give a background into how it's treated today and thought about, and kind of the different ways in which, yeah, it's both. Uh,
How is it treated? Yeah, how is it treated, and then maybe we can get into why you think about it differently or what you have to
yeah,
say
sure.
about it.
Well, it's definitely a contentious issue. So, in my experience, talking to practicing biologists, if you invoke the word teleology, it's often kind of frowned upon. You know, the famous quote, "Teleology is the mistress, right, of." I can't remember how it goes, but I think that's very much true and alive today. That having been said, there are a lot of biologists who are more open to the possibility of talking about purpose, and folks like Mike Levin that are very receptive to the notion. And then you get a lot of people kind of at the intersection. So the big meeting, agency, directionality, or direction and functionality, I think, which brought together a lot of interdisciplinary researchers, most of whom all are kind of receptive to resurrecting some sort of notion of purpose or functionality or teleology in biology. And then you have people that are fine with the notion of teleonomy. There was a recent special edition in the Biological Journal of the Linnaean Society that was addressing teleonomy. So when it's talked about in that kind of term, it's usually you find a rosier reception among biologists.
Am I right in saying that one could portray a narrative that maybe earlier in the past century there were times where purpose was kind of shunned? We didn't want to study purpose, whether in biology or really any of the sciences. Whereas more recently, it's something that's explored
Yeah,
more.
definitely in the
Uh,
earlier 20th century, it was often viewed as being more contentious, and there definitely has a fraught history. So in the 19th century, you had people advocating for kind of vitalism, and that seems like something that's generally rejected today. Kind of the notion of an entelechy or vital spirits or something like that. Really is not very scientifically tractable. So most of the people who went in that direction in the 19th century, that hasn't been pursued in a long time. And then when you had the modern synthesis and the architects of the modern synthesis, I mean, there was a major move towards kind of understanding biology mechanistically. And if you're in that camp, teleology, as it was traditionally talked about, is a non-starter. So that's where you have people like Ernst Mayr trying to retain some sort of notion of teleology, recognizing that if you give up on the idea of purpose in biology, you're just giving up a tremendous amount of, it seems like, what we really want to explain, but really making a very concerted effort to do it in a way that is compatible with kind of the mechanistic conceptions of biology that you find coming through really powerfully in the 20th century. But today, yeah,
so you
oh,
said the word,
sorry.
yeah. Go on, go
Today,
on.
it seems like we've kind of got epigenetics and holism in biology making more of a return. I think that there's more of a reception now to notions of purpose and teleology than maybe there was 50 years ago.
Mm. It's interesting you say, right? So there is some people that thought when you look at and you see, say, parts in biology, it's to do with functions, it's to do with the goals that they're there to help pursue. It just, how can even biology sometimes work, right? It's, or, you see the function of, say, a heart, and then all the parts kind of go, it kind of makes sense to the heart then. Whereas, you kind of have to almost ply your brain and try and see it from a different perspective in like in a more abstract sense if you were to remove the function and try and get and so you mentioned the word teleonomy, so tell me a bit about that. So how can you do without
Yeah, so
purpose?
if you try to make the move like Meyer did to teleonomy, the way that he conceived of it was as a program that could either be an open or a closed program. For him, genes were kind of the real evidence that you could conceive of goal directedness through a kind of closed program in genes. He thought of learning and kind of various modes of transmission through learning as an open program. And that seemed really promising when he was first writing about this stuff in the 70s and 80s. It's just subsequently, as we've learned more about genetics, we've just learned that I mean, in spite of what some people would think, or argue, conceiving of genes and genomes as kind of a program just actually does not seem to be the apt way of thinking about them. So Myers kind of real hope that replacing teleology with teleonomy and conceiving of it as a program just has not panned out, I think, in the way that he would have hoped, given the research that's been done in genomics and whatnot. So yeah.
Hmm.
So, hence the move to
So,
holism.
and so tell me a bit more about a DNA as a closed system. So would his thinking there be something like you don't need some kind of inherent purpose in biology because DNA it's kind of a bit matter of fact. It's not doesn't really need to have any purpose. It's just sort of running a program, and so it's kind of neither here nor there. You don't need to say it has a purpose towards something. It's just been selected for
Yeah,
perhaps.
basically, his notion was that in evolution and natural selection, there is no purpose, there is no teleology. That he just thought was flat out wrong. Anybody that would advocate for that, but he did acknowledge that, boy, oh boy, it sure seems like organisms display really purposeful behaviors. So you have to give some sort of reckoning of that. And his idea, particularly say like developmentally, right? So his idea was that look, there's this stuff, DNA. It's given to us by evolution via natural selection, which is not teleological. However, these kind of closed programs in DNA, setting learning aside, it's a closed program in that it's not going to change throughout the life of the organism. However, using that program, the program runs and basically gives rise to what you can call purposeful behavior in the same way that a program could give kind of purpose and directionality to a homing torpedo or a robot or whatever you have. So that was his kind of conception. So he wanted, I mean, he was unlike, say, B.F. Skinner, who went so far as to even deny that humans have goals, right? If you go like the full behaviorist route, then you really just have to give up on any conception of purpose or goal directedness or anything like that. So Meyer did not want to go that far. He recognized that organisms sure act like they've got purposes and directionality. And if you're going to give up on that, you'd really be giving up on a lot. And so he wanted to retain some sort of notion that you could talk about it intelligently. And it sure seemed like DNA is this kind of thing that you might be able to understand mechanistically as a program, and yet it could account for purposeful behavior.
Tell me a bit about how you might define what we mean when we say purpose, because it's interesting if we say purpose but we say someone might say something looks like it has a purpose but it doesn't really have one. It's and or oh well there's in some sense the DNA in the system has a purpose but the in like sort of zoomed out I don't know that so it's tell me how we should think
Oh,
about these
that's great.
concepts.
I wish I could give an easy, definitive answer to that question. I really can't. It's wide open territory. The one way that you can kind of think about it, at least going back to Aristotle, which is where I tend to, you can find a lot of the origins in Aristotle and Plato. So in the beginning of Aristotle's Physics, Book 2 of the Physics, or in Plato's Timaeus, are where you kind of get the first real fleshed out accounts of goal directedness. So for Aristotle, the distinguishing characteristic of purpose is in nature, which is actually how he kind of defines natural stuff, are things that have an internal source of motion or change, that where the motion or change doesn't appear random, you can't kind of appeal to randomness to make sense of why you have sharp teeth in the front of your mouth and kind of flat teeth in the back of your mouth to chew. So for Aristotle, he said clearly they're there for a purpose. The purpose in this case is, to chew food, right? So just a really intuitive sense of what purpose is for Aristotle there. And then he contrasted that with artifacts, where an artifact is something that gets its purpose from the outside. So why is the purpose of a hammer to hit nails? Well, it's because, you know, a person created it for that purpose or that role. So he made that really big distinction, and I think that sticks and is fairly intuitive. If you move up to more modern kind of notions, definitely the one that Dan and I adhere to is that all purposeful systems kind of have two hallmarks, which were really picked out by systems theorists and cyberneticists in the early 20th century, and these are persistence and plasticity. So, persistence is the capacity for an entity to pursue something, and even when it gets knocked off course by a perturbation, it'll return to that course and keep heading towards it. Plasticity is that kind of no matter where you put the starting point, it will head for that same end point, kind of regardless of the starting point. So for us, those are really the hallmarks of how you pick out a purposeful system from a non-purposeful system. How well, of course, that maps onto the idea that, like, what's the purpose in my life or something like that is an entirely different question.
No, sure, and maybe we could get to that at the end. But it's interesting because when you say a definition of purpose like that, is that something which need only apply to biology? You know, in the sense of, are there other non-biological systems that can have purpose, and and is that the only, and so you define a purpose like that? How would other people think
Yeah,
about
so
it as
you
well?
have
So
been reading my stuff. So yeah. I definitely advocate, and I've dragged Dan McShay along with me. And there are some other people, other theorists who would probably agree with some of what I'm saying. But if you use those as kind of the hallmarks or the markers of purpose or goal directedness, for me, then I say, well, actually, you locate a whole spectrum of things outside the living world, outside the biological world, that exhibit different degrees of that sort of behavior. Granted, much more minimal. Certainly, artifacts, the kind of classic example, something like a homing torpedo. But there are all sorts of other examples that vary from, you know, rocks falling down wells to balls rolling down funnels and ending up in a tube sort of cases, all of which seem to exhibit small amounts of persistence and plasticity. So yeah, so I'm willing to kind of bite the bullet and say that, yeah, in a very negligible sense, you can say that those are purposeful systems or goal-directed systems.
so right, so a ball rolling down somewhere, it's kind of going to, it's, you push it off course, but it's still going to go down to the bottom of something, or even perhaps a rock falling, and what use is then this definition of purpose? If what, you know, how should we think about it, if because I mean that seems kind of very minimal, and it's like, okay, cool, it has purpose, but then why is it
Yeah.
something?
So I think that's an excellent question, and probably the intuitive question that a lot of people would have, and I'm very sympathetic to it. So yeah, so if you have such a wide, permissive kind of notion of purpose or goal directedness, it really just, yeah, at that point you say, okay, what descriptive value does this have anymore? And I think I have a twofold response to that. So on the one hand, what the aim here is, at least for me, I'm not going to drag Dan, my co-author, on a lot of on this stuff with me. I won't drag him along. So this is just me talking, though he'd probably agree with a lot of what I'm saying. I think the first thing that's really key to me is moving away from a binary notion of purpose, where some things are purposeful, others aren't. So historically, the distinguishing characteristic of, say, life is that it seems to act with purpose. And what I find problematic about that is that there are just far too many counterexamples of, I can point at all sorts of systems that seem to exhibit really seemingly purposeful kind of behaviors that aren't alive. And then vice versa. Well, if you're defining life that way, we really don't even know what the hell life is, anyhow. Sorry, I probably shouldn't swear on.
No,
Um,
you can.
so, without actually any hard and fast definitions of what we're actually looking for when it comes to locating living systems, then to me, that's just kind of a non starter. So I want to just throw away this kind of binary notion. And sure, and other people would say, well, you have to have something like cognition or consciousness or something like that to exhibit purpose or have purpose. Yet, I mean, then you're going to exclude bacteria that surely, as they move up a chemical gradient, are exhibiting something that seems really purposeful. So it seems to me that kind of no matter which direction you go, you have bullets to bite. So I choose to bite the bullet of, just finding it in lots of different places and having a very graded conception where there's very, very minimal notions of purpose. So that would be akin to a rock falling down a well, which, by the way, is an example from Ernst Mayr. And then to very purpose driven systems, probably like us sort of stuff. Um, but the other thing that I would say, kind of another virtue of having a really permissive conception, is that historically, another big problem in all this is the division between essentially what are often deemed the physical sciences and then the life sciences. So this is kind of a big cleavage, right, in the academic world. And to me, that just is deeply problematic. I'm a thoroughgoing physicalist, so I'm not. I want a naturalistic account of this stuff. I don't want to look for spooky causes. And to me, kind of even having that division in the academy, in higher ed, it's weird, right? Why should the life sciences be excluded from the physical sciences? It gives the impression implicitly that there's something about the life sciences that isn't inherently physical, like the rest of the physical stuff. So the notion of kind of having a graded account of purpose is unifying insofar as it suggests that what's special about life is actually you can find it in a lot of non-living stuff too. So even again, graded conception, I wouldn't suggest that a rock is just as purposeful as you or I, but I think that kind of unifying conception does a lot of work in getting rid of the kind of lost cause of, or in my view, not very fruitful effort of trying to find something special in, say, the organization of how living things are constructed that somehow makes them just wholly unlike everything else that you find, that borders on that kind of emergent or non-physical quality. And yeah, I don't want to go there.
When in reading your work, it's interesting you talk about this example of, imagine something, an object falling to the ground, and you can say its kind of purpose is to do that. And on the one hand, that might sound weird if we know about gravity and the fact that, well, I mean, obviously it would fall to the ground. We know about Newton's findings of gravity, but if we didn't know about gravity, like people before didn't, then you could just kind of have to go, well, look, the kind of that is what things purpose is in a sense, in that point when they're falling to the ground. And so you have this notion of almost fields external to something give purpose to a thing below it, within that field. Tell me more about that. It's a kind of intriguing notion of defining purpose. Why is
Yeah.
it
So
helpful?
yeah, clearly you've been digging into the stuff Dan and I have been working on. So this is a theory that I've been helping develop. It's originally Dan McShay's theory. We call it field theory, and you've done a really nice job of kind of distilling it. So yeah, the idea is that goal-directed phenomena, so goal-directed causes, or you could say teleological causes, we think are explained by kind of looking externally to what we call fields, which are these larger than structures that envelop and contain smaller than structures kind of spatially. and they're responsible for that sort of teleological causation. They don't account for all types of causation, so you still were absolutely fine and think that looking for mechanistic causes is absolutely essential to doing good science and an absolutely crucial, necessary component of a lot of these systems. But the kind of directedness, those hallmarks of persistence and plasticity, you're going to find those by looking outside to external fields. And yeah, my view is very much that a lot of the stuff that we find kind of mysterious and we haven't been able to find mechanistic causes for so far, I think is in a lot of ways pretty analogous to the position that you might have imagined Aristotle in, right, before we knew about gravity. And this was actually a real problem that Aristotle and a lot of ancient philosophers grappled with is, yeah, how do you account for the motions of rocks and things like that? Not interesting. He definitely didn't think they had souls or anything like that, but he did, depending on the interpretation that you go with, kind of say that, well, the natural place of a rock is down, and things that get in the way are impeding its kind of natural tendencies to go downward. And that has to be something kind of internal to the nature of the rock that causes it to do that. And of course, I mean, I'm really sympathetic. Yeah, if you don't know about gravity, that's probably, I think, the explanation that any reasonable person would come up with, or something like that. So yeah, you really need somebody like Newton to come along and point to these kind of larger things like gravitational fields to be able to account for something like that. And yeah, so what Dan and I are essentially trying to advocate or argue for is that oftentimes the way that historically these kind of big revolutions have happened is via locating these external um, sources of motion and change, not always just the internal causal route, which again, we're totally fine saying, yes, yes, the discovery of genes was really, really important and did a lot of very key things, finding those kind of deeply buried mechanistic causes also within us, but it's not the whole story.
So, yeah, like in more complex systems like us, would you say there are internal causes of purpose as well? Like, tell me about what external fields are on, say, humans, like living organisms. What are acting on us that help gives us
So,
purpose?
so I'd say kind of a twofold thing here. On the one hand, kind of in the theory that we've developed, this hierarchy the whole way. So the boundary is not just between, say, the organism or my skin and the environment, which is, I think, the place that we tend to go. So I think the first thing that I would highlight is that organisms in particular are deeply nested hierarchical structures that go all the way down to, the molecular level, which, yeah, if you're a molecular biologist, all that's really clear. But so, and again, I think there's a lot of interesting work being done here. You can point at things like morphogenetic fields and how they guide development, and kind of cellular, you know, protein folding and all sorts of. They're really kind of great examples in some of the literature that are coming out on this sort of stuff. So, in our view, I won't go into a lot of the details on this, but essentially, we contain, that is, we organisms contain a whole slew of fields within ourselves that act downwardly on entities within us. So the kind of hierarchical structure of goal directedness, say in a developmental system, a lot of that's going on under the skin of organisms, and it has that same hierarchical structure where there's something bigger enveloping something smaller within us, and that bigger thing guides the smaller thing. One of my kind of favorite examples of this, though we still don't actually know the science on it, but I think it's kind of a nice illustration. I have to credit Dan with this. This is not my own example. Is that when you kind of think of, how is it that both of my arms are pretty much exactly the same length, give or take? Um, it's rather miraculous, right? That if you had this mechanistic system that somehow knew as cells are dividing during growth exactly when to stop. Um, on each arm with such precision that you get exactly the same length arm on each side. I mean, it's almost inconceivable to think how you would engineer a system that would have such a small degree of error that it would get such precision on both sides of the body and kind of all these symmetrical, limbs that we have. What seems much more plausible to us is that, in fact, there's kind of a field that's going on in your body that is guiding the development of this symmetry in limbs on each side, and it's regulating the growth on each side. And that's how you get such precision in the degree and kind of get equal lengths in all these capacities. If it was just down at the cellular level where each cell had to know exactly when to shut off to match what's going on way over on the other side of the body, I mean, from an engineering perspective, that just seems implausible. Almost entirely impossible to imagine how even something like natural selection could engineer a system like that. So that's one thing to say. Probably that's actually the less interesting thing to say. The more interesting thing to say is that, ultimately, if you kind of follow out our theory to its logical conclusions, it seems like it would entail that when I act in goal-directed ways, I'm being directed by stuff outside me. And here again, I bite the bullet, I suppose you could say, and acknowledge that, actually, I think that is more or less how goal-directedness works, that for the most part, my behaviors are dictated through external factors that are outside me.
But and so we can get into thinking about that, but even savor what we've kind of talked about just now. It's interesting because within an organism like us, when you have such nested structures acting on the structures below, acting on further structures below and above them, and it's kind of like that adds a level of complexity that it's interesting as well. So would you say, like, imagine you have like individual cells, but even the cells around them, and maybe bioelectrics, Michael Levin and others work on that, and other kind of fields are all acting on those cells. And then even within a cell, there's constraints acting within the things within the cell. So would you say you never need to, or maybe you never want to just, we talked about vitalism at the start. I guess would you say you never want to just say there's something in it intrinsically that's giving it purpose, because otherwise where is the interaction between parts that's leading to purpose?
So I think for us, or at least in my view of this, it's easy. I think so we would never want to downplay or brush away the importance of kind of lower level mechanistic causation. So clearly there is still internal stuff going on that for us are mechanistic causes that are absolutely important. And without those, you would not have the higher level phenomena, the purposeful kind of directedness. So to pick out kind of a really salient, fairly simple example, right? You could think about the goal-directed behavior of a sea turtle or, say, salmon going to find their natal river or something like that. Seems like the way how they're able to pull this feed off is through the Earth's magnetic field. They have very finely tuned mechanisms internally that allow them to essentially detect that magnetic field. And that is, those are very finely tuned, and we would never want to underplay that, because without those mechanisms, it would be entirely impossible for them to do this. However, what we're trying to emphasize and say is kind of a different type of causation is that similarly, by the same token, without that much larger magnetic field, they would also be utterly lost, have zero guidance, and would be totally unable to find their natal beach or the river that they spawned in, or what have you. And by the way, if they had not evolved on a planet that had exactly that magnetic field, they wouldn't have those lower level mechanisms either. So we do give some sort of priority to the higher level external fields that shape and refine those lower level mechanisms. And it's not to underplay the importance of those kind of smaller mechanistic causes. But if you want to locate purpose, which again for us, persistence and plasticity, you've got to look up at the level of fields, not at the mechanistic level.
Right. And in our say in you mentioned this example of arms of different length, well, a very similar length, and how is all this coordinated? Um, and how could, especially because in the growth of our bodies, it can kind of navigate perturbances. A lot of experiments are showing, right? I mean, for example, I even think often about you cut an embryo in half, and the embryo isn't destroyed. It's now like you get twins, and it's how weird. And so, but do we know about all? What level is our understanding of all these different fields? Are there fields we don't know exist, and yeah, and what is the nature of these? For example, bioelectric fields or morphogenetic. I mean, tell me about
Well,
that.
I actually think so. This is where I'll definitely, again, emphasize that I'm a philosopher. So this, I have limited knowledge of the biology of a lot of these systems, and I can toy around with it enough to just enough to get myself in trouble. Um, I think the general comment that I would make is to say that our hope for kind of developing this theory and pointing towards these kind of what we're calling fields as being the sources of purpose and directionality and goal directedness is to emphasize that empirical research often would be benefit from locating these and trying to falsify kind of claims that we're making. So we're trying to make a theory that you know is very friendly to empirical testing. And insofar as that's true, we kind of shrug our shoulders and say that oftentimes it's going to be left to the experts in these areas to kind of pick out what the relevant fields might be for them in those areas. And I mean, we're totally open to the possibility that in certain cases, maybe there aren't any. I mean, this is a theory after all, right? This is our grand hypothesis. We kind of have some of the really nice examples that we think lend themselves to illustrating what we're talking about. We find them at various kind of levels of biological organization. We think that the architecture of all these is very, very similar. Kind of anywhere they pop up, you see a very similar phenomena going on. But I think part of our effort is really making a call to the scientific community to really say, create a taxonomy of these, figure out what the differences are fields that you kind of find at the really large scale, are they fundamentally different in certain unified ways from what you find, say, at the organismal level? And are there reasons to kind of doubt the claims that we're making? So basically my point here is I think that there's just a lot of work to be done on this front. I think some of what Mike Levin does, say with bioelectricity and morphogenetic fields, is really great evidence and illustrates what Dan and I are talking about really, really well. It's very pioneering, interesting work. I think those are great examples of kind of a couple areas of fairly well specified what we're calling fields. I think there are a tremendous amount of other areas where I would really be curious to know what the experts in those areas would consider to be the relevant fields that are kind of creating these causal
Mm.
chains going downward.
It's interesting because when I think about these concepts scaled up to the whole human level, it's as you kind of say, maybe even it's a bit counterintuitive. Are there fields greater than us and acting on us, shaping our goals? Because I guess it feels like when we say purpose, we kind of want it to be like it's in me, it's mine. If something's outside of me, is it really uh like who we kind of want to say what entity then is controlling that? I mean, maybe you could say then if purpose from fields outside of ourselves act on us, you could say in part they are part of our identity. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. But I'm just trying to think this through. What fields act on us then as a
Oh, I
whole
mean,
organism?
I think that there are countless fields. Certainly, in the case of humans, there are a lot that are pretty easy to point out. Of course, how they're physically constructed or construed, I think that that's a really interesting philosophical problem that I think about occasionally, and I have a couple things to say about. But definitely things like cultural, economic fields. I mean, those are very clearly having all sorts of downward influences on us. I mean, I think we talk about economic fields in a couple of our papers a little bit, but I mean, there are just countless social, cultural fields that clearly are, I mean, massively dictating lower level human behaviors. But to the point of, are we then kind of being controlled from above? Is it really my purpose if I'm actually just being driven by these external forces? Well, on that front, I think there are a couple things to say. Some of the work done in moral psychology that looks at a lot of experimentation in psychology um, that is actually called situationalism, I think tends to be right. So it seems like there's a lot of psychological data, right, that illustrates that situation far more than character is predictive of how someone's going to behave. So the Milgram prison experiments and a lot of those, I know right now their standing isn't that great, but they not only were ethically they a little questionable, but they haven't really been able to be replicated. Nevertheless, it seems like there's just an extraordinary amount of data that comes out of psychology that really says that if you want to know how somebody's going to behave, kind of controlling or setting the situational inputs that they're getting are really going to tell me far more about how they're going to behave than anything I could really learn about their personality or what they purport to kind of hold as their defining characteristics. So I think when you actually look at a lot of that psychological data, you walk away kind of realizing that, my God, actually probably most of all the actions that I take throughout my day are really being driven by all these situational inputs. Again, what Dan and I would call fields. I think similarly, you can kind of look at other things like a lot of what we have coming out of latest massive data collection and AI algorithms. I mean, my God, if you have a smartphone on that has all the sorts of tracking that goes on in all of these, with the right amount of data, it's astonishing how predictive that sort of stuff can be as to what I'll be doing next Tuesday at 4:05 in the afternoon. Actually, with the right amount of data, you can almost get that down pat. So I think there's a lot of things like that. That on the one hand, I think of all these things as me freely choosing. I'm acting as an agent in the world. I'm choosing these paths, and yet that's the paths that I choose are still highly predictable when you have the right information to work with.
Mm. Well, it's interesting because if you kind of say these higher level incentives influence us a lot. I mean, I'm doing economics, and that's kind of their approach would be. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing you want to think about. I mean, sure, you need some sort of changes to an individual, their preferences, but really you want to look at the system and the environment around them. It's interesting because you mentioned, say, economic fields, right? Like if we think about the economy as a kind of field acting downwards on all of us, I would sometimes I've asked in a more philosophical sense, why do we call the economy a thing? Why? There's lots of different fields. Why call the economy, the economy, as if, out of all the things, it's because you can't see it, right? Tell me what the economy is, right? It's a bit of a weird concept. And that makes me think that perhaps only through thinking about it as a field that has agency on us, and then we, in some weird way, can kind of, in like a sense of like Hayek, the way we influence prices and we influence the economy then influences other people. So it's feels like a kind of causal field in that sense, right? And that makes me think that's kind of why we call it a thing. That's why we talk about the economy, is because it is an important field that we act on and that acts on us. So yeah, and then you kind of want to think about what can we map out all these different kinds of
No.
fields.
So I think Dan and I would definitely, I'll speak for myself here. I would definitely agree with you that I think there's a big way in which an economic field, and of course I think there are various economic fields that I would again rely on economists to pick out far better than I could ever do picking them out. That act downwardly, which is to say act causally on all the things kind of contained within them. And yeah, on the one hand, it feels a little spooky. You can't point at it. I can't ostend to the economic field, but I can't ostend to an electromagnetic field either, right? And we treat those as pretty real entities in physics. So just the fact that I can't kind of see it or point at it is not too troubling to me in the way that I might be able to point at other types of fields that you could identify. So again, this is where I think kind of developing a taxonomy of these things would be really handy and useful, and I'd love to see somebody work on that more. But the other thing that I could probably add to that is that there is this debate in philosophy, and I think that there's an interesting parallel here between how natural selection acts and whether it is a causal force that acts downwardly on whatever the units of selection are below it, or whether it's just kind of the sum of all of the parts. So in philosophy of science, there's this debate that I think would map on to the point you were just making about kind of us and the economy, which is, and there are two schools of thought on this, which is to say, in one case, natural selection is treated as something that has causal effect downward on, say, organisms, if you think that they're the units of selection, that acts downwardly and causes things to happen to organisms. The other view that you might take is that what natural selection is just the statistical sum of all of the movements of individual organisms. And you kind of, apply put a number on all of that, and that is all natural selection is. So it's what in the philosophy of science is this debate between causalists and statisticalists as to what natural selection is and how it works. And I think it actually maps on pretty well to the point you just made about the economy. So yeah, if you're in the statisticalist camp, then you'd say, the economy is not really a thing, right? All it is it's just kind of the sum total. If you took all of our individual actions and you kind of gave them a neutral statistical value, that's all we mean when we're pointing at the economy, but it's not really a thing. But if you're in kind of the camp that I'm in, then you say, no, it's a real thing. It acts it's the real cause of why I choose to, buy a house now and not later, and based on these interest rates and whatever. It's causing my behavior. It's causing me to do things.
No, it's interesting because it's, you could say, yeah, is the economy, is evolution just a useful name to characterize them, so we can point to this thing, but really it's from the lower levels, like, and then it's just all the sum of all the parts. But I don't know, it kind of begs the question. I mean, what do we mean by it's just a useful, like a helpful name, or because what parts do we identify as the important parts to why, say, because if you look at because I don't know, if you look at the sum of only the organisms, you could also be like, oh, what's an organism? Stop talking about organisms. Just talk about chemicals. So just talk about physics. I don't know. Then it's like, what? And then I feel like then it's not very helpful. No one level is kind of privileged. It's like, well, fields act downwards, and then there's upward. You kind of want both, right? But obviously, some things are more important than others. Some things exert more causal agency, and that's something we need to pick out. That's why we have science. But
Yeah. So I think, part of what you're running into here, part of what we're running into is kind of the classic debate between reductionism and anti-reductionism. So if you want to go the full reductionist route, right, you end up at Dawkins and say that genes are the units of selection, and all we are is their big, survival spaceships or whatever his famous phrase is. But if you take an anti-reductionist route, which is definitely the view that I support or argue for in various places, I think there are reasons to pick out higher level entities. So you mentioned organisms. It's maybe important not to reduce everything down just to the level of genes and say, no, there are actually these organisms. And it's not just a sum of parts. And why is it important to pick that out? Well, again, looking at somebody like Mike Levin's work, because we've been talking about him, you might say something like it's helpful to pick out an organism as a higher level entity that is a relevant real unit. If you want to talk about something like a natural kind, it's a real thing. And that's because there's a certain sort of we're all moving in the same direction, right? And so Mike would say something like, me and all of my lower level parts are, you can call us a relevant entity, organism, agent, because if all of a sudden you have some cancer cells that start doing their own thing, that becomes a problem, and they've kind of escaped the control, that downward force of all the other cells that have been machined down and really finely tuned to kind of all act in service of this larger level thing. And the way that I think that comes out most clearly is when you actually identify the ones that escape that control, as in the case of cancer. You could think of other similar like cases, and then it becomes really useful to actually have and be able to talk about that higher level entity, that organism, because it's the only way you can make sense of something like the behavior of a cancer cell, and kind of make it intelligible. And I think that you could apply something similar, not as robust. I think that the kind of an economic whole does not have the cohesion that an organism has in anywhere near that level. Yet there is a sense in which I think you can pick out these kind of relevant, cohesive economic things that it's useful to actually identify them as real entities in a certain respect, and not just the sum of lower level parts.
Mm. Um, I think one interesting thing that the way we're talking about these things now makes me think about is some of Rupert Sheldrake's work on fields like with memory, and that is like your memory is not contained in any one medium, and it makes me think about, he also has related theories about the mind and the degree to which is the mind fully localized in the body, or because I'm sorry, I'm going on those different sort of strains here, but it's interesting because I think about even dualism and the questions about consciousness and the mind, because that feels like, if we want to be kind of say that consciousness and the mind has a real effect on us, then we're saying, but then is it then, and then obviously problems like the hard problem, how do we get that into a physicalist way of thinking about that? So I mean, is there a way to think about the mind or other things like memory as a kind of field, in the sense that it can have cause, how should we think about that in terms of
Wow, we're
agency
covering
and
all
causation?
sorts of great ground today. Well, yeah. So the first thing I'll say is I'm not a philosopher of mind. I don't have anything deep and important to say. There are many other people that are much smarter and have had much better things to say about all of this than I ever have. But again, I definitely take I'm a thoroughgoing physicalist. So yeah, I'm not would never advocate for kind of the dualistic notion of a mind. Definitely would say that minds are brains, or and brains in a very liberal notion of the term. And But I think you can think of these in kind of anti-reductive ways that make sense of higher level thinking. And I think there's actually interesting stuff that's going on in neuroscience that points to the non-locality of something like our thoughts, our mental states, that you're never going to find the neuron that causes X, Y, or Z. I mean, some of it's relatively speculative, some less so, but I'm thinking here of folks like McFadden and people like that. So there is interesting neuroscience that kind of is looking for these types of global phenomena that, to me, are very physical systems. They're just non-local physical systems. They're global systems. But to kind of give an example of an anti-reductionist account of something like this, and this is an example that I'm stealing from Ron McClamrick, who has worked in these sorts of areas. A fairly kind of nice analogy that gets away from where you might want to posit spooky things is if you just think about a carburetor. So you think about a carburetor. I'm mechanically minded, so this is intuitive for me. I apologize for those of you who are not mechanically minded, but if you have a carburetor, there's a choke and a throttle in a carburetor. Those are kind of two key components. And as it happens, both work through just valves. So you have a valve that opens and closes, opens and closes. Of course, a choke, the valve opens to richen or get higher ratio of fuel to air, when the engine's cold. So you pull that choke out, helps start a cold engine. Once the engine's warmed up, you close that valve again. And then the throttle, of course, is how you actually increase engine speed, where you allow more of that fuel air mixture into the combustion chamber. So the interesting thing, right, from an anti-reductionist perspective here is that, well, if I tried to reduce this, if I try to be a reductionist and I try to say, well, I want to know what these things really are. Really, the choke and the throttle are just both valves. If I reduce them down to their lower level component parts, they're just valves. In fact, I think in some really simplistic carburetors, like the ones on lawnmowers, sometimes you can actually switch the valves. You can actually take the valve from the choke and put it where the or the throttle is and swap them back and forth. So at a lower level, they're identical. They're exactly the same thing. However, of course, at a higher level, if you go talk to any mechanic, they're going to say, no, there's a huge difference between a choke and a throttle, right? At the higher level integration of the system of a whole, what it takes for a carburetor to work to get an engine to go, those are two very different parts. And if you confuse them, you're not going to get the engine to run at all. So if you try to do that reduction, if you try to reduce a carburetor down to its lower level parts, you're going to totally miss the distinction between a throttle and a choke that you only get at the higher level view, where everything is context dependent. So no spooky claim here. I'm not claiming that a carburetor, that a choke or a throttle are spooky or non-material or something. No, they're very physical systems. There's nothing about a carburetor that isn't physical or can't be explained kind of in very mechanistic terms. But what I am committed to is saying that, yeah, you'll actually also never be able to reduce that down to its lower level parts and be able to make sense of the system.
Right. And then the kind of relation to the mind, would you say in sense that, we can always point to one single thing like neurons and say, oh, hey, we found the mind, but there's always going to be something that that we can't completely grasp, not because the mind isn't in the brain. Again, we don't need to posit something spooky necessarily. It's just that, again, what kind of name do you want to give to this high level structure kind of acting, and it's like with your example, there is something that meaningful, and and you can't just reduce it to the
Yeah. So
valves.
I think very much something like, I do have these things that are these mental states, right, that I can describe in phenomenological terms and what have you, and they're descriptors at a higher level, and they have a lot of explanatory value, right? If you want to explain my behavior of why I'm walking around a grocery store in a seemingly aimless way, well, a really helpful tool to have would be that he has this mental state right now. It's buy milk, find the milk, right? And if you tried to reduce that down to give kind of lower level a neurological descriptor of what the find milk mental state is, you'd probably have a hell of a time doing that sort of reduction. So it's really helpful to actually posit this higher level mental state as a real phenomenon. It's really there. We really have these things. But that's not to have to claim that they're somehow not physical or that they're not entirely linked up to how my brain is configured. And of course, there's just mountains and mountains and mountains of reasons to also suggest that those mental states that I have can be scrambled and messed up in all sorts of really important ways if we start poking around in the physical stuff that is my brain. So they're intrinsically linked to each other, and kind of, we can talk about supervenience and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, and people would disagree with me on this sort of stuff in philosophy of mind debates, and like I say, this is outside my area of expertise. But yeah, I mean, my general position is that I'm a physicalist, but if you go the reduction route, you're going to miss a lot of important stuff. In the same way that, yeah, if you start trying to reduce down something like what I would call an economic field, you're actually losing a lot of really important explanatory tools that you have in economics when you posit those things as real, explanatorily valuable that describe human behavior. If you had to explain it all in terms of lower level individual human behavior, my God, that would be a next to impossible task, right?
Right. Well, tell me about what are you working on at the moment? What is the future of your
Right
work?
now, I'm in the midst of developing a kind of an overview course on ethics in life sciences. One piece of which for me that's really important is actually exploring the ways in which what we know about science impacts how we think about ethics. So that's one thing that I'm working on, which deals with kind of notions of functionality, teleology, and how that plays into our conceptions of dysfunction. And then also with Dan McShay and kind of continuing to develop our theory, I'm exploring kind of some fine grained distinctions between functions and goal directedness and how these systems apply in kind of cosmological scales. I'm going out really, really big rather than going, I'm stepping away from the biology a little bit and looking at the cosmos more.
Tell me a bit more about that, so because I remember, was it Michael Levin and Bernardo Kastrup talking recently about um, sometimes Michael Levin's tack is that we see this activity as, it looks like neurons, and that's mental activity, but then something else, well, yes, in a complex dynamical way, it kind of looks a bit, like, how do we know what things do and do not act in complex ways, and exert agency, and have thoughts, so what are you thinking about in this
Well,
cosmic scale?
so in the cosmic scale, kind of in the stuff that I'm thinking about right now, I'm mostly thinking about how you might conceive of these things as being directional. But speaking to Mike's work on this, I mean, I'm very on board with a lot of his notions, particularly when it comes to what we call in philosophy multiple realizability. So yeah, I think there are deep problems with trying to identify, say, consciousness or mental states with that brain stuff that we happen to find in the biological creatures that we have here on Earth, sort of thing. And so I tend to agree with a lot of directions that Mike goes, and that actually pattern recognition is probably a more important feature to be looking at rather than the particular material stuff, particularly when it comes to complex systems, whether you're thinking about memory or what have you. So most of this stuff tends to be I think multiply realizable when you kind of move away from the really myopic focuses that some of us tend to get entrenched in.
Right. And that the kind of thing you're thinking about in on a cosmic scale, like kind of fields and because I guess it would make sense. I mean, for example, you can think about evolution and the large scale fields that direct organisms, but then like on a larger scale, like how do we get the physical universe that we
Yeah,
know?
so I mean, up all the way to the cosmic level, just ways in which you might be able to recognize directional systems from non-directional systems and how you go about doing that, but also ways in which you might conceive of, Gaia hypothesis stuff and how you might think of the Earth as kind of having an integrated whole that's subject to processes of Darwinian selection, and there's kind of these various competitions between biochemical cycle variants and stuff like that. So that's what I've been thinking about lately.
Mm, awesome. Well, thank you very much,
Absolutely, my
Gunnar.
pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.